thank you very much for the second time, David, and thank you all very much for staying. I thought it was only in Germany that people stayed for 3 hours without asking any questions at public lecture events. I think the lecture, by the way, is back. The public lecture is back. It's a great form, and you've proved it this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, our chosen subject is the relationship between war and democracy, concentrating especially on the ancient democracy of Athens. The choice is, of course, not innocent. Like all questions directed at the dead by the living, it's inevitably posed and given prescience by current-day conundrums and political conflicts. War and democracy is back as a topic of great public concern in many countries, and for strong reasons. All actually existing democracies are now caught up in the sticky threads of what could turn out to be a permanent war against terror. Things are happening that some find alarming. In the name of democracy promotion, armies are gathered, democratic procedures are manipulated, whopping lies are told by elected leaders in to rain down awful violence on enemies and innocents. In the name of democracy promotion, a growing number of democratic institutions are themselves militarized. The specter of something like a garrison state has begun to cast a shadow over actually existing democracies, not for the first time. Public demonstrations are prohibited, or their scope is subject to new restrictions, as around the House of Commons in London. Civilians are put through dummy exercises and subjected to many new forms of surveillance and routine so-called security checks. No joking signs placed at airport checkpoints or in the lobbies of public buildings remind citizens that the authorities are not joking. Slowly, steadily, institutional procedures are tightening. Police powers are expanded. The dark arts of surveillance are flourishing. Intelligence organizations, like the U.S. National Security Agency, so secretive that it's popularly known as the No Such Agency, assemble large databases using network analysis in search of cluster patterns of telephone calls that might betray enemies. Magnetometers, biowatch air sniffers, razor wire, CCTV TV cameras, and concrete fortifications of city life. Have a look at the British Embassy in Berlin. Torture is meanwhile justified publicly. In some circles, habeas corpus is transformed into two ancient words of foreign origin. The old division between the torturable and the non-torturable classes, Graham Greene's expression, makes a comeback. Journalists who report these trends, like those recently at the New York Times, are denounced for compromising national security. And sometimes I have the impression that there are no dangerous thoughts anymore because thinking itself has become dangerous. All citizens are meanwhile warned to be vigilant at all times, as if life was merely a permanent battlefield. Citizens begin to hear loud calls for governments even to take preemptive military actions against grave threats to their survival or to their civilian population, a quote from Alan Dershowitz's recent book. Of course, I'm exaggerating, but given these various trends, I say nothing here of the counter-trends. It's little wonder that some observers, for example, the young Australian scholar Daniel Ross, have been tempted to draw the conclusion that democracies have a built-in tendency to produce violence and to dump it both on themselves and others. Ross himself draws the colourful conclusion, and I'm quoting, that the origin and heart of democracy is essentially violent. Violence, defined as action forceful enough to produce an effect, not a very good definition, by the way, as I think a reviewer in the Sydney Morning Herald pointed out, closing your garage door amounts to violence. But leaving that point aside, according to Ross, violence is not just the result of contingent policies of particular democratically elected governments, it is inherent in every effort to establish or to maintain democracy. If by that is meant, and I'm quoting, any political system grounded in the idea that sovereignty lies with the people. The principle of the sovereignty of the people can never establish itself democratically. Democracy is a strange impossibility. It always and everywhere rests upon acts of originary violence. And I'm quoting Ross, the massacre of indigenous populations or the crushing of those who oppose a new foundation of the people's sovereignty, as well as the ongoing history of forgetting this original violence, not out of spite or indifference, but because the violence at the origin of democracy threatens democracy itself. I'd like to set aside various objections to the way Ross defines his concepts, I think rather poorly, and mobilizes words to produce strange silences and unjustified insinuations, to note only that the conjecture that democracy and bellicosity are terrible twins is probably a healthy corrective to evolutionist views of democracy, like those of Francis Fukuyama, that see only its peaceful, freedom-loving qualities, or prefer to emphasize its world historical tendency, as Fukuyama does, to spread secular, science-induced economic growth across the whole earth. To insist that democracy has a violent heart is correctly to draw attention to the deep historical implication of democratic institutions and ideals in the facts of fantasies and of war. But this is among my central conjectures to you. The protest it launches against democracy as an engine of war, paradoxically, feeds upon a deep-seated tendency for latter-day democracies in particular to denature war and other forms of violence. The thesis that democracy has a violent heart, in other words, is symptomatic of the unusual sensitivity of actually existing democracies of our kind to war and to other forms of violence. Contemporary democracies, I want to suggest to you, enable the democratization of violence. It's a mouthful, but it's just 3 words to describe a tendency that I think is very important and completely written out, so to say, of Ross's account. By this I do not mean that democracies encourage the arming of all citizens. A stealth bomber perhaps for the Vice-Chancellor of the university and some AK-47s for his staff and for each of us. I don't mean that by democracy. I don't mean that, and I don't mean that all get armed in order that they can engage in the violence of their choice, something like a macabre reversal of the historic ballots, not bullets principle. Rather, to speak of the democratization of violence means that democracies as we have come to know them unleash a process of the denaturing of violence in policy fields as different as the treatment of children and women in domestic settings. Think of the way in which the very term domestic violence, for instance, is a neologism of the late 1950s. There was always, in many contexts, in many different forms, violence against children and women, but the naming of it and the attempt in policy terms and political ways to rid domestic settings of it is symptomatic of this kind of trend that I'm describing as the democratization of violence. And this is clear also even in efforts to rein in political leaders, Slobodan Milosevic, rest in peace, and military personnel who show no respect for others' dignity and instead practice cruelty as a way of life. The historical roots of this denaturing of violence run very deep. They begin with developments in the ancient Hellenic world. Think, for example, of George Grote's remark that Athenian Democrats hated the tyrant who subverts the country, who violates women, who puts men to death without trial. That sensibility against violence and war, despite all the bellicosity of Athens, is already implicit and in some context explicit in those 2 centuries. The roots, of course, are very complicated, as I say, and they include such medieval and modern developments as the invention of mechanisms of political mechanisms of compromise. That is what parliaments are, non-violent means of adjusting and getting some kind of working compromise among potential combatants. It includes the history of the birth of civil societies, the development as well of weapon systems, as I'll say a little bit later, that promise overkill. And of course, bad experiences with the cruelty of both anti-democratic and democratic regimes doing things in the name of the people. I have no time to examine all of these trends in all of their complexities, and I've tried to do that in the Violence and Democracy book, which points to one major effect of this democratization of violence, namely that in actually existing democracies of our time, institutions and acts of violence tend no longer to be seen as willed by gods or a god, or determined by historical fate or by so-called human nature. Non-violent methods of publicly checking and regulating institutions of violence take root. They have the aim of ensuring that police forces, armies, secret intelligence bodies, private security companies neither perpetuate surplus violence nor become privately owned by any particular power group, including the government of the day. The democratization of violence and war is a process that renders institutions and acts of violence publicly accountable and is therefore contingent, as alterable through human will and effort. This process of democratization even affects the very language of war and violence. The scope of application of these descriptors, war and violence, broadens. Think, as I've already mentioned, of the case of domestic violence, or think of the invention of the language, the term war criminal. These are symptomatic of this, I would say, historical growing sensitivity to the problem of war that has very deep roots, and it carries with it the implication that with political will and effort, with calculation and some luck, there can be a reduction of violence, indeed an outright prevention of war under certain circumstances. Why is it that democracies tend to democratize or denature war and other forms of violence? Well, for a start, we've heard Josh Ober speaking about this very helpfully. For a start, democracies, by definition, enable public criticism of the necessity of war and violence, thanks to a whole cluster of institutions. This process is felt particularly intensely in the geological upheaval that usually happens at the end of a violent dictatorship, where there's a public outpouring of criticism of the ancien regime. It's accused of rape and murder. Searches begin for those who have been disappeared. Clandestine mass graves are exhumed, and citizens are urged to tell their stories of cruelty and suffering. In more modest and moderate and extended form, something like this happens when democracies function reasonably well all the time. Furthermore, the markets on which democracies typically depend are threatened with destruction by war. Many, not all, businesses and other civil society organizations consequently don't much like war or fear its destructive effects. Moreover, literature and art produced and or circulated under democratic conditions or with democratic aspirations have often played and continue today to play a vital role in denaturing war and violence and its pity. Think of the work of Kate Kollwitz. Think of some of the works of Shostakovich. Think of, for example, the satires of war that came from the typewriter of Edward Thompson. Think of the novels, short stories of writers otherwise as different as Nabokov or Celine or Kafka. Democracies also have a normative problem with the cruelty and death that war brings. If democracy, to put it simply, is a set of institutions, a whole way of life structured by non-violent means of equally apportioning and publicly monitoring power within and among overlapping communities of people who live according to a wide variety of morals, then war and violence are anathema to its substance and spirit. But there is something mentioned briefly in my comments to Josh Ober about democracy that runs deeper than ethics. A feature of democracy that's usually given insufficient attention by observers, but captured powerfully in one of the greatest odes to the democratization of spirit that democracies encourage and require, Ludwig Wittgenstein's unfinished aphorisms that were later published as On Certainty. The point is this: the institutions and everyday culture of democratic institutions require for their operation shared perceptions of the complexity and contingency of the world, of the non-necessity of things, an understanding that reality is not real, that claims to veracity launched by any actor can be doubted because they inevitably depend upon the acknowledgement of others, that in principle the extant power relations in any context can be named, redescribed, challenged, and altered in the name of greater equality and openness and humility. That, it seems to me, put very abstractly, and I'm now going to try to illustrate this in practice, comes very close to the core of the spirit of democracy as I understand it. This sensitivity to contingency, this doubt about know-alls, this respect for complexity, this attachment to humility. That is why nobody in a democracy should ever rule like a monarch sitting on a throne, and no president with war-making powers should be able to do what that president does without being publicly accountable to those over whom he governs. In our times, the democratization of war and violence is, of course, merely a trend, with no historical guarantees of success, alas. Yet it implies and demands greater sensitivity, I think, to time-space variations of the vexed relationship between violence and democracy. My point is that essentialist propositions such as democracy is inherently bellicose or violence is at the heart of democracy, Daniel Ross, should be doubted and set aside in favor of efforts to think more deeply about their historically contingent relationship, beginning with the case of ancient Athens and its Democratia. Because we've had now almost a couple of days of concentration on Athens, I shan't say very much except to observe that democracy in that city-state got off to a rather bad start, if only because the innovative power monitoring and power controlling institutions that were part of its birth and stormy survival became thoroughly entangled very quickly in contingent circumstances of empire building, war, and rumors of war. The Athenian experiment with Democratia took place in a geopolitical laboratory of constant rivalry tinged with violence. Throughout the 6th century BCE, years before the age of democracy, Athens had been involved in less than a dozen, probably, military campaigns, all of them for limited goals. It had resembled a frog sitting quietly on a rock overlooking its pond. It had been just one among 1,000 of the regime's mountainous island micropolities during this long period. But as the military victories of the proto-democracy piled up, it was slowly but surely drawn into an extended struggle, mainly against Sparta for hegemony over the Greek world. In the wake of the triumph over the Persians, there began during the 480s, thanks to a windfall of silver, mentioned already, a vigorous expansion of the navy. 200 warships were constructed and resources were poured into building vast fortifications to protect the city and the port of Piraeus. Then came the first efforts to assume leadership of a confederacy of Greek states called the Delian League, whose several hundred members vowed to have the same friends and enemies, and whose military aim was the liberation from Persian control of the Greek island states and cities of Asia Minor, modern Turkey. Step by step, state by state, Athens turned itself into an imperial power, a geographically extended form of dominating power that the Athenians called an arche. The feeling that they were at the center of the universe of Greek-speaking peoples engendered immense pride among the Athenians. Many regarded themselves as a cut above the world as they knew it. Strong traces of pride in their achievements are much in evidence. For instance, in Thucydides' famous account of the funeral oration delivered by Pericles at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, an oration that concludes with the remark that Athens, of course, has become the school of Hellas. Talk of Athens as a teacher and master of the whole Greek world burned like dung in the fires of empire. It did so by fostering belief in the citizenly virtue of military prowess, and by twinning Democratia and military success. War and rumors of war put a spring into the steps of the demos, as Aristophanes pointed out forcefully when joking that his fellow citizens would launch a fleet of 300 warships if their Spartan enemies dared to steal even a puppy. War made everyone equal in the struggle to escape the clutches of death. War, one could say, blessed life with unshakable meaning. It temporarily set aside the pessimistic thought that men were like leaves in the wind, the mere shadows of shadows, meant only for the moment, like a passing day. War also brought wealth to their pockets and revenues to the democracy. It enabled it to pay for the machinery of government and to employ vast numbers of ordinary Athenian males as soldiers and men as citizens as jurors. The Athenian democracy became known among its friends and enemies as a busybody for its eternal restlessness. During the 5th century, Athens found itself at war on average perhaps 2 out of every 3 years. Never once did it enjoy more than a decade of peace. Especially with the introduction of pay for military service in the 450s, war came to dominate the everyday lives of Athenians, their visual arts, the proceedings of their assembly, even the justification of democracy. Even the word demokratia was infected with the spirit of war. This is a complicated point that I can just literally skip over. It's a matter of opinion and it's controversial, of course, but one of the striking things for me is that the very word demos, from demos and kalatin, to rule, carries within it the notion of military conquest and rule over others. Kalatin, often translated in a rather anodyne way as rule, in fact has deeper and older connotations, militaristic connotations of control of others. So it's very odd that the very word we've come to love, many of us, and associate with non-violence and restriction of war, is at the outset the very word itself, is a carrier of the conquest of a demos of its opponents. Now this dalliance of democracy and armed force was, as we know, to prove fatal eventually. It soon led to restrictions upon political freedoms at home. Democratic inventions like short terms of incumbency, the public obligation to speak courageously, parrhesia, and the political exclusion of potential demagogues began to be overwhelmed by democracy, understood as imperial expansion and greatness. The whole episode contained several lessons. It showed, for example, that the institutions of democratia could be used to overwhelm democratia, that the growth of the tree of empire from the seed of local democracy gives undue prominence to military-minded leaders, in this case elected figures like Cimon and Pericles, who unusually were entitled to hold office for multiple successive terms, who were also entitled by custom to interrupt assembly proceedings to introduce their own business. This growing militarization of political life in support of empire began to turn Athens into its own worst enemy. At home, it unleashed a malignant force that the Athenians called delusion. Ate was their word for it. It bred misguidedness, manifested, for instance, in their declining interest in compromise and their habit of seeing glory in the fall of cities and the subjugation of other peoples. Appeals to a fictive common ancestry also grew louder. They took their cue from a more restrictive law of citizenship passed in 451 BCE that aimed to make it impossible for metics and foreigners to become Athenian citizens. This was not yet nationalism as we know it, but rather a drive towards homogenization fueled by war. The dalliance of democracy and armed force had wider geopolitical implications as well. It is true that there were times when citizens downtrodden by their local nobility or suffering from stasis, as it was called, openly welcomed Athenian intervention and influence in their local affairs. A model example was the rebuilding in 444-443 BCE of the ancient city of Sybaris, which received an influx of settlers, a new layout, and a brand new democratic constitution. The trouble was that the dalliance of democracy and armed force contained the seeds of expansion by anti-democratic means. Democratic laws and arrangements might have to be imposed, perhaps by cunning or, if necessary, by means of violence. But if that were to happen, as it did, then Athenian democracy found it increasingly hard to place things in the middle, as their citizens like to put it. Athens came face to face with an ugly possibility. In the name of democracy, and for the sake of upholding or expanding its own position, It was forced to set up garrison colonies, to plunder whole cities, even to heap cruelty on those who tried to stand in its way, as the Melians found in the years 416 and 415 BCE. The military campaign against Melos showed not only that democracy could inflict violence upon its neighbors, it implied as well that war could prove to be a double-edged sword for the Demokratia. It could become subject to the charge of double standards and to acts of military reprisal. The struggle of Athenian democracy against its Spartan and Persian enemies had a flip side. By arming to protect itself, by acting as if it had been born into the world to give no rest to either itself or to others, it encouraged its rivals, Philip II of Macedon, for instance, to seek and to win the ultimate prize of drowning democracy in its own blood. This point about the mortal danger posed by empire to democracy is reinforced by the growing evidence that we have of scores of democracies in the Hellenic world, some of them much older than that of Athens. In my history of democracy, I'm very interested in these democracies, of which there may have been up to 100. We have limited evidence for most of them, but we know of their existence. The fragmentary evidence from these democracies, like Ambracia, Chios, Kyrene, and Heraclea Pontica on the southeast of the Black Sea, is not always good news for Democrats, I'm afraid. Sometimes the evidence describes in painful detail the destruction of democratic institutions, either by military conquest, or by conspiracies of the rich, or by demagogues, or single-minded tyrants, or by all four in some sequence. In each case, there is an important reminder of the utter contingency of democracy, of the ease with which it can be blown away by violence like a leaf in the autumn winds. These democracies also raise questions about their political compatibility with democracy in imperial form. I hope you see that this is all something of a not-so-coded simile about our times. Yes, democracies that operated at a distance from Athens highlight the sobering point that ancient democracies were rarely established democratically. That's a point that has to be swallowed if you are a Democrat. There are very few exceptions of democracies being established democratically, and it is just possible, if you define your terms carefully, that this country was one of the very few in the history of democracy. Should be proud of that. It depends on your definitions. Indigenous peoples, of course, have a right to object to it. But the point about these democracies, some of which were much older than Athens, is not only that they were not established democratically, but they were sometimes born of resistance to military intervention and violent power grabbing. It's also clear that these ancient democracies should be of interest because they suggest that the imperial democracy, that democratic imperialism of Athens was only one form of democracy, and that the whole trend towards empire building and imperialism made everybody, all citizens and states, vulnerable to what contemporaries called stasis. I mean, a democracy in imperial form, to put it in plain English, had wrecking effects on these democracies in some context and at some times. Stasis it's a very broad term used to describe the factional squabbling, outright sedition, open civil war, bloodshed, and mass exile that was endemic in a geopolitical system of interdependent city-states that lacked any coordinating center and was therefore sucked into a vortex of permanent rivalries made much worse by the imperial power itself. That is why, during the 360s, the Arcadian Confederation came into being. It's very interesting, or it should be for us. It tried something never before attempted in the history of democracy, namely to form a confederacy structured by the rules of democratic negotiation and compromise. And among the key institutions that the Arcadians invented was a confederal assembly called the Mirioi. Open to all citizens of the region, it was the first ever experiment in cross-border or regional democracy. The attempt by the Arcadian League to set up brand new mechanisms for protecting democracy on a regional basis rested, I think, on a working principle that remains as rock solid today as it did then. The principle can be put something like this: in order to survive and flourish, democracies must tame the military and political pressures on their borders. We might even speak of an Arcadian law. The viability of any democracy is inversely proportional to the quantity of outside geopolitical threats to its existence. That Arcadian law contained a gloomy corollary, a warning that democracy could be misused to kill off democracy. The Arcadian initiative in cross-border democracy, arguably an early effort to democratize war and violence, showed that the Athenian model had worrying implications for the plurality of democracies of the region, that the Athenian Empire, a dominant power that measured its strength against all its rivals combined, which is what an empire is, was capable of gobbling up democracies in the name of democracy, and that therefore democracies had a strong self-interest in banding together peacefully to ensure their survival through politics, so as to avoid their massacre through rivalry, expansion, and armed conflict. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm making an appeal here for greater open-mindedness and sensitivity to context when analyzing the relationship between democracy and war. The point is strongly reinforced, I hope, by the fact that from around the 10th century CE, democracy entered a second historical phase whose center of gravity was Europe itself. It was from here on that a new form of democracy was invented that was not based on the assembly. It was shaped by forces as varied as the development of rural kings, the rebirth of towns, the rise in northern Spain for the first time of parliament, not a British invention, by the way, and the conflict unleashed by self-governing councils and religious dissent within the Christian church. Democracy, as a consequence rather blindly of all these inventions, came to be called representative democracy. This at least was the term that began to be used in France and England and the new American Republic during the 18th century, for instance by constitution makers and influential political writers when referring to a new type of government with its roots in popular consent. No one quite those who invented this term. The Marquis d'Argenson, who was the foreign minister of Louis XV, is one who certainly used it, but it's a great enigma.